Hello, future attorneys! Welcome to lecture number 5 of our last-minute tip lecture series for the 2025 bar exam. This lecture will focus on recent cases and important concepts in political law to help you prepare for the first subject on the first day of the bar. So let's start. Let's start with the principles on exploration, development, and utilization, or the EDU of natural resources. Later on, we'll apply these to a recent Supreme Court case. The EDU of natural resources is primarily governed by Article 12, Section 2 of the 1987 Constitution. The first sentence of this provision expresses the Regalian Doctrine or Jura Regalia. Under Jura Regalia, all natural resources are owned by the state, and all lands are presumed part of the public domain unless clearly shown to be of private ownership. And lands of the public domain cannot be disposed or alienated by the state except agricultural lands. So I hope you are able to recall the classification of lands of the public domain under the Constitution. There are 4: agricultural, forest or timber, mineral lands, and national parks. The other 3 cannot be alienated. But there is one exception to the Regalian Doctrine, and that is the native title to land. Lands covered by native titles are not presumed part of the public domain. Instead, the presumption is they have always been private land and they have never been part of the public domain. So what is a native title? So a native title is the recognition that some Filipinos, like our indigenous peoples, already owned and occupied certain lands long before the Spaniards came. So their ownership does not come from any title or grant of the government. It comes from their continuous possession of the land since time immemorial. Section 2, Article 12 also provided the 4 acceptable modes in the EDU of natural resources. But before the modes, let's remember the underlying requirement. The exploration, development, and utilization of natural resources shall be under the full control and supervision of the state. And in all these modes, the state must always have full control and supervision. The EDU of our natural resources can be done either, number 1, directly by the state, number 2, jointly with Filipino citizens and qualified Filipino corporations through co-production, joint venture, or production sharing agreements. So sa mode na to, let's recall the foreign equity limit on the EDU of natural resources. Foreign equity in corporations engaged in the EDU of natural resources shall not exceed 40%. In other words, the corporations must be at least 60% Filipino-owned. Third mode is through small-scale utilization of natural resources by qualified Filipino citizens, and this mode shall be carried out in the form of a law. And last are the Financial and Technical Assistance Agreements or the FTAAs. Under this last mode, 100% foreign-owned corporations can participate in the EDU of our natural resources. But there are safeguards, and we'll go into these safeguards later. Okay, so let's focus on the last mode, the FTAAs. The Supreme Court clarified that despite the language of the Constitution, what is referred to as agreements for financial and technical assistance is not really limited to financial and technical assistance agreements. This provision of the Constitution also applies, or it also covers, service contracts. So what are service contracts? These are agreements between a service contractor and the government. The contractor provides service and technology for the extraction and production of petroleum, while the government provides the financing. All petroleum produced under the service contract belongs to the government, while the service contractor is entitled to a fee. So that's a service contract. So just to recap, the provisions in the Constitution on FTAAs also apply to service contracts, and these service contracts are not banned under our present Constitution, but they are likewise subject to and must comply with the constitutional safeguards. When entering FTAAs, the Constitution provides safeguards to prevent abuses. So again, this is the only mode of EDU of natural resources wherein 100% foreign-owned corporations are allowed to participate. So the safeguards are quite stringent. So number one safeguard is the parties themselves to the FTAA. On the part of the government, only the president can enter into FTAAs, and the other party must be a corporation. The president cannot enter into FTAAs with natural persons. Next, FTAAs are limited only to the large-scale EDU of natural resources. So large-scale usually refers to very capital-intensive activities. And the intent here is to limit FTAAs or service contracts to those areas where Filipino capital is not sufficient. Next, FTAAs and service contracts are limited to the EDU of minerals, petroleum, and other mineral oils. So they cannot be executed in relation to other natural resources. Next is the notification requirement. So when the president enters an FTAA, he must notify the Congress within 30 days after the execution of the agreement. And of course, FTAAs must comply with the provisions of existing laws. And they must also be based on real contributions to economic growth and general welfare of the country. And lastly, they must contain the mandatory provision of promoting the development and use of local, scientific, and technical resources. Now, let's apply these principles to a 2023 case, Ocampo versus Macapagal Arroyo. This case involved the constitutionality of the Joint Marine Seismic Undertaking or the JMSU in the South China Sea, executed by the Philippine National Oil Company, the China National Offshore Oil Corporation, and Petro-Vietnam, with the authorization of the governments of the Philippines, China, and Vietnam. The JMSU covers about 143,000 square kilometers of the South China Sea, claimed by the three countries. So the JMSU covers disputed area in the South China Sea. And the purpose of the JMSU was to conduct a joint research of petroleum resource potential in the South China Sea as a pre-exploration activity. So remember that word, pre-exploration. The petitioners questioned the constitutionality of the JMSU, saying that it violates Section 2, Article 12 of the Constitution. One question resolved by the Supreme Court in this case is whether the requirements under Section 2, Article 12 of the Constitution applies to the JMSU. And the Supreme Court held that yes, the JMSU is covered by Section 2, Article 12. and it must comply with the requirements under this provision because the JMSU involves the exploration of natural resources. The Supreme Court interpreted the term exploration as it is used in the Constitution. So it looked at the ordinary meaning of exploration and how it was defined in the Philippine Mining Act and the Petroleum Act. And essentially, the Supreme Court found that the term exploration encompasses activities of searching and investigating to discover and determine the extent and potential use of natural resources like minerals or petroleum, including all necessary work. And applying those definitions, the Supreme Court found that the JMSU involves the exploration of natural resources since it was executed to determine if petroleum exists in the area covered by the agreement. And although the parties designated the joint research as a pre-exploration activity, it has no bearing at all in determining the nature and the purpose of the JMSU. Having resolved that the JMSU is covered by Section 2, Article 12 of the Constitution, the Supreme Court next ruled on whether the JMSU is constitutional by its standards, and the court found that it is not. The JMU is unconstitutional for allowing 100% foreign-owned corporations to participate in the ADU of natural resources without the safeguards under the Constitution. Also, it is not executed in any of the four acceptable modes that we discussed. So it is obviously not directly undertaken by the state or jointly with Filipino citizens or qualified Filipino corporations. The JMSU also does not qualify as an FTAA or a service contract. Remember that this is the only mode which allows 100% foreign-owned corporations to participate in the EDU of natural resources. But the JMSU does not provide for financial or technical assistance. And the parties even admitted that the JMSU is not a service contract. The court further said that even assuming that the JMSU can be considered an FTAA, still it failed to comply with the safeguards under Section 2, Article 12. So it is not entered into by the President on behalf of the state. And obviously, there can be no notification to the Congress if the President himself did not enter into this agreement. So let's recap. The JMSU is covered by Section 2, Article 12 of the Constitution because it involves the exploration of natural resources. And it is unconstitutional for allowing wholly owned foreign corporations to participate in the EDU of natural resources without observing the safeguards under the Constitution. Next, let's take up Esmero versus Duterte in relation to national territory. This is a 2021 Supreme Court case. And it is about the petition for mandamus filed by Attorney Esmero against then-President Duterte to compel him to defend the West Philippine Sea against Chinese invasions. The theory of Attorney Esmero is that the President has the ministerial duty to protect and defend the country's national territory by either filing a case with the United Nations Security Council or by suing the Chinese government before the International Court of Justice, among other remedies. So the Supreme Court dismissed Attorney Esmero's petition. The Supreme Court reiterated that the President is immune from suit during his incumbency, regardless of the nature of the suit filed against him. So a petition for mandamus cannot be filed against the President during his incumbency, as well as other kinds of petitions or suits. This case has an interplay with remedial law, so you can recall this also when you review REM. The Supreme Court held that mandamus cannot be used to compel the performance of discretionary acts. Mandamus is proper only to compel the performance of ministerial duties. And the President's actions on foreign policy, national defense, and external affairs, including how to handle disputes with China, are not ministerial. They are discretionary. The court noted that Attorney Esmero failed to point out any specific provision of law requiring the President to go to the UN or to sue China before the International Court of Justice. So the manner of defending our national territory is left to the President's judgment or discretion. Next, let's go to the Bill of Rights. Arrests, searches, and seizures. The Constitution guarantees the people's right to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. But when is arrest, search, and seizure considered unreasonable? So arrests, searches, and seizures are considered unreasonable when done without a warrant. And the arrest, search, or seizure does not fall within any of the recognized exceptions or the instances of valid warrantless arrests and searches. As a general rule, arrests, searches, and seizures can be done only if there's a court-issued warrant. Otherwise, they're unreasonable. So let's first recall the exceptions or the instances of valid warrantless arrests under the rules of court. So we have the in flagrante delicto arrest or caught in the act, hot pursuit arrest, and the arrest of an escapee. But remember this, the violation of an ordinance or regulation is not one of the exceptions. It is not one of the instances for a valid warrantless arrest or consequent search or seizure, especially when the penalty in the ordinance or the regulation does not involve imprisonment. And this is the ruling of the Supreme Court in Ridon versus People, a 2024 case. Next, there are also instances of valid warrantless searches under jurisprudence and pertinent laws, rules, and regulations. So what are some of these instances of valid warrantless search and seizures? Number 1, search incidental to lawful arrest. So if police officers carry out an arrest, whether with a warrant or a valid warrantless arrest, they can search the person arrested and the immediate vicinity to prevent destruction of evidence and to ensure their safety. So the arrested person may be hiding evidence or dangerous weapons. Next is consent searches, or when a person voluntarily consents to a search. So this is considered a waiver of the warrant requirement. Next is the plain view doctrine, or when police officers are doing legitimate police business at a certain place and they happen to see an object within their plain view that is so obviously illegal or a contraband. They can seize that object or item even without a warrant. Next is the search of moving vehicles. This is also a recognized exception to the warrant requirement. But remember that this is valid only if the police officers have probable cause to believe that the vehicle contains evidence of a crime. What about in case of checkpoints? Search in checkpoints are also valid, but remember that it is limited only to visual inspection. The police officers should not do a thorough search or ask the passengers to disembark, unless again there's probable cause to believe that the vehicle contains evidence of a crime. Another exception are customs searches at the borders and ports of entry. These are generally exempt from the warrant requirement to prevent the smuggling of contraband. Then, the stop and frisk search, or what we call the Terry search, where officers may stop and frisk the person if they have reasonable suspicion that the person is involved in criminal activity and may be armed and dangerous. In addition to the exceptions we discussed, the Supreme Court also recognized the validity and the necessity of administrative warrants, or the warrants not issued by the courts but by administrative agencies. Although the administrative warrants are recognized as an exception to the requirement of a judicial warrant, the Supreme Court laid down guidelines for their validity in Board of Commissioners versus Wenle. This is a 2023 case. According to the Supreme Court in this case, for an administrative warrant to be valid, it must comply with 8 requirements. The Supreme Court emphasized that all these 8 requirements must be complied with for the administrative warrant to be valid. Number 1. The danger sought to be prevented must be imminent and must be greater than the damage to be suffered by the person deprived of the right. So this requirement balances the individual's right to liberty or privacy versus the state's right to protect public welfare. So if necessary to protect the public interest, then individuals' rights may be restricted. Number 2. The deprivation of right by authority of an administrative warrant must not be permanent. It must only be temporary or provisional. And to make the deprivation permanent, there must be strict compliance with procedural due process requirements. Number 3. The administrative agency must be authorized by law to perform specific implementing acts. Number 4. The administrative agency must also be authorized by law to resolve conflicting rights and obligations. In other words, the administrative agency issuing the administrative warrant must have quasi-judicial powers, and the issuance of the warrant is incidental to the performance of its functions. Number 5. Just like judicial warrants, administrative warrants must also be based on probable cause, supported by tangible proof, and they must be issued in relation to a particular violation. And the requirement of particularity. Administrative warrants must be specified as to the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. Number 6. The administrative warrant must not be used to file a criminal complaint. Remember this, any evidence obtained pursuant to an administrative warrant is inadmissible in criminal proceedings. So if there's evidence obtained under the authority of the administrative warrant, then it can be used in relation to the administrative proceeding itself, but it cannot be used in a criminal proceeding. Number 7. The person held under a warrant shall be formally charged within the period stated under the law or the rules. If there's no such period, then within a reasonable time. He shall also have the right to counsel, and the issuing agency has the duty to notify the regional trial court nearest the detainee for the purpose of issuing a judicial commitment order. And last, if any of the previous 7 requirements is not complied with, then it is presumed that the officers of the administrative agencies issuing the warrant are guilty of usurping judicial functions. Remember that as a general rule, only courts can issue warrants. They are also presumed guilty of malfeasance, misfeasance, nonfeasance, or even graft and corrupt practices. Next topic are legislative inquiries or inquiries in aid of legislation. Let's take the 2023 case of Ong versus Senate. This case involved the Senate's inquiry about the Commission on Audit's findings on unspent and or misused government funds in relation to the COVID-19 expenditures of the Department of Health. The Senate subpoenaed resource persons including Lincoln Ong, one of the directors of Pharmally, which is a supplier of personal protective equipment during the COVID-19 pandemic. And another is Michael Yang, a former presidential advisor and businessman. Both Ong and Yang were ordered arrested and detained by the Senate in relation to the legislative inquiry. Ong was cited in contempt for allegedly giving false and evasive statements, while Yang failed to attend earlier hearings. So they both questioned their arrest and detention. Although the Supreme Court found that this case was already moot because the detainees were already released and the inquiry was already terminated, it is still an important case because it clarified the scope of the Senate's power of inquiry and contempt. So this case affirmed the power of the Congress to compel the attendance of resource persons by holding them in contempt or ordering their arrests or through other means. The Supreme Court held that this power is inherent for the Congress to carry out inquiries in aid of legislation. So this power exists even if not written in the Senate Rules of Procedure. But while this power is recognized, the Supreme Court also reiterated that this power has limitations. Number 1, the inquiries must be in aid of legislation, meaning it must be relevant to the crafting or to the amendment or to the evaluation or review of laws. Number 2, the inquiries must be done following the duly published rules of procedure. And number 3, the rights of resource persons must be respected. Also, if detention should be necessary and proper, that detention should last only until termination of the legislative inquiry. In this case, the Supreme Court found that the Senate failed to observe the third requirement. It failed to observe the rights of the resource persons. For Ong, the Supreme Court found that the Senate violated his rights since the Senate imposed punishment for contempt upon him without giving him the opportunity to contest the allegations against him. And for Yang, The Supreme Court found that the subpoenas were not properly served to him and that he was ordered arrested even before he had the chance to comply. Next is a case under election law. St. Anthony College versus Comelec. This is a 2023 case involving Comelec's Oplan Backlash during the 2022 elections. In implementing the Oplan Backlash, the Comelec dismantled or confiscated tarpaulins, posters, and murals displayed on the private property of several supporters of then presidential candidate Leni Robredo, including St. Anthony College. The petitioners questioned Comelec's actions, claiming that it violated their freedom of expression and property rights. And the Supreme Court agreed. The Supreme Court ruled that Comelec does not have the authority to regulate privately owned election materials displayed by private citizens in their private properties, because under the law, the Fair Election Act, the Comelec may only regulate the election propaganda of candidates and political parties. Moreover, if enforced against private citizens, the Oplan Backlash becomes unconstitutional because it violates the citizens' right to freedom of expression. The Supreme Court noted that political speech enjoys the highest level of protection, and that if these were to be regulated, the strict scrutiny test must be applied, which the Comelec failed in this case. Oplan Backlash also violated the property rights of citizens since their private properties were forcibly removed or taken from them. Next is a case on the freedom of speech and expression. ABS-CBN Corporation versus Ampatuan. This is another 2023 case. And this case involved the interview of an ABS-CBN reporter, George Carino of Lacmodin, Lac-Saliao. So Lac-Saliao claimed to have been present when the Ampatuans planned the massacre. So the interview aired in 2010 when the Maguindanao massacre case was still pending. Since Andal Ampatuan Jr. was implicated in the interview, he filed a petition for indirect contempt against ABS-CBN, Carino, and Saliao, claiming that the broadcast prejudiced the pending trial and that it also violated the sub judice rule and interfered with the administration of justice. On the other hand, ABS-CBN and Carino invoked the freedom of speech and of the press and claimed that the broadcast was a fair report on matters of grave public interest. In this case, the Supreme Court said that sub judice rule is indeed a recognized exception or limitation on the freedom of speech and of the press. So what is sub judice rule? Public comments and media reports that may influence the outcome of an ongoing case, especially criminal trials, can be restricted. The Supreme Court dismissed Andal's petition here on a technicality, saying that Andal's petition failed to state a cause of action. But the Supreme Court said that if the petition had properly stated a cause of action, ABS-CBN and Carino would have been guilty of indirect contempt because when they aired Saliao's interview, they essentially presented a witness testimony on national TV before it was given in court. and this violated the sub judice rule and may be considered usurpation of the trial court's role in receiving testimony and subjecting it to cross-examination. Although the Supreme Court also clarified here that the sub judice rule does not automatically override freedom of the press, and there is still a need to strike a balance between judicial integrity and the media's duty to inform. There are also a few significant cases on the people's right to privacy. One is the Integrated Bar of the Philippines versus Purisima, wherein the Supreme Court held that the BIR regulation requiring self-employed professionals like accountants, lawyers, or doctors to submit their rates and register their appointment books to monitor their tax compliance violates the right to privacy. These appointment books contains client names and the date and time of their consultation, and these are information over which they reasonably expect privacy and must be respected. What about online chat logs and videos? Can they be used as evidence in the prosecution of a crime without violating the right to privacy of the concerned individuals? In People versus Rodriguez, the Supreme Court held that yes, online chat logs and videos can be used to assess if a crime has been committed, and this will not violate the right to privacy of the persons concerned. Lastly, let's talk briefly about impeachment, which is also a relevant topic now, considering the issue on the dismissal of the impeachment complaint against VP Sara Duterte. Impeachment is an instrument of accountability under the Constitution. It is a mode of removing high-ranking officials from office if it is found after hearing that they committed grave crimes against the country. Let's recall who the impeachable officials are and what the grounds are for impeachment. For impeachable officials, remember our mnemonic, PVOX. So they are the President, the Vice President, the Ombudsman, Constitutional Commission members, and Supreme Court members. Other than the President, all the other impeachable officials are qualifiedly immune from suit, which would affect their eligibility to hold the office outside of the grounds for impeachment. So, for example, Supreme Court members are immune from disbarment suits during their tenure. For the grounds for impeachment, remember this mnemonic, can the big guys be held? So, culpable violation of the Constitution, treason, bribery, graft and corruption, betrayal of public trust, and high crimes. Remember that an impeachable official may be impeached only if he or she committed any of these grounds during his or her incumbency. Acts committed before he or she became an impeachable official is not considered for the purpose of filing an impeachment complaint. So what is the effect if an impeachable officer is impeached? So it does not necessarily mean that he or she is automatically removed from office. Impeachment does not mean automatic removal from office. The removal or the disqualification from office will be imposed only after a finding of guilt, and this requires the 2/3 vote of all the members of the Senate. Note also that the President's power to grant pardon does not extend to impeachment cases. So if the Vice President is found guilty after impeachment trial, the President cannot pardon him or her. And lastly, the controversial one-year bar rule. Under the Constitution, no impeachment proceedings shall be initiated against the same official more than once within a period of 1 year. But when do we start counting that 1 year period? The case that we've always referred to was Francisco versus House of Representatives, which held that the 1 year period should be counted from the initiation of the first impeachment complaint, and that an impeachment complaint is initiated upon the happening of two things. Number one is the filing of the complaint, and number two is its referral to the proper committee. So once those two things happened, the impeachment complaint is initiated, and the 1 year period will start to run. Thank you again for listening, future attorneys. I hope this lecture helped you review some of the important political law concepts for your first exam. Good luck and see you in the next lecture.